Hi there, this is the second video associated with the adding versioning step, part of the series developing an MVC component within Joomla. Now in the first step we looked at the general overview, but in this second video I'm going to look at the Joomla observer pattern in particular, and this is what makes this little interaction here work, where we have the table functionality here, emitting an event or publishing an event on After Store, which needs to be picked up by this content history library code. So this is a view of the observer pattern within Joomla, or you may know it as a publish subscribe sort of pattern. It's a bit complicated, this diagram, but we'll go through it bit by bit and hopefully it will become clearer. But on the left hand side here is the functionality, or the code, which is the subscribing functionality or the observer functionality. So this is the functionality which wants to get notifications from on the right hand side, the publishing code or the publishing functionality or the observable classes, the observable instances. And in the middle we've got some glue, which is Joomla glue, which connects the publishing functionality over on the right hand side to the subscribing functionality on the left hand side, or as it says here, the observable functionality here to the observer on the left. Now I've also marked classes in these red rectangles. So what's in the red rectangles refers to the class and to class or static methods. So here's my class. What we're wanting to do here is we want to notify my class about events in some class. So this is my class. This is a static event or static method here. And the blue rectangles then refer to instances or objects. And so the functions here are instance methods. And the third thing is that we've got three different sorts of arrows here. We've got these purple ones at the top, then green ones, and then orange ones. And those depict the three sort of stages that there are associated with this publish subscribe sort of mechanism. So we'll go through them bit by bit, and we'll start with these purple arrows. So the first thing that is done when my class wants to get notifications from some class is it calls this function, the static function within JObserverMapper, add observer class to class, and it specifies its own, or the class which is the observer, and it specifies the class which it wants to observe, and it passes those as parameters. And all this static method does here is it creates a table which says that my class wants to observe some class. And that's the first stage. The second stage is whenever some class creates an instance. And in that case, in the constructor of that instance, it does two things. Let me just zoom in a bit there. So the first thing it does, it creates a new JObserver updater and passes to it this, which is basically the identity or reference to this blue box here. And that JObserver updater is this bit of glue here, which is going to take the events from the observed class and pass them through to the observing classes or the observers. So the first thing it does, it creates that class, gives it a reference back to this blue rectangle here, and takes a note of that. It sets up an instance variable here this updater, so it has got a reference to this blue object here. The second thing it does then is it calls this static function here, JObserverMapper, attach all observers, again passing itself as a parameter. And that will come into our JObserverMapper class, and this static function here, attach all observers. And this is the $S is a reference to this blue object here. And what this function does is it looks through this table and finds, well, what are the classes which are wanting to observe this class that I've got notification from here. And for each observer, it calls a static function in that observer class, which is create observer. So in my class here, we have to have this static function create observer. And what that will do is it will create an instance of my class and pass it the reference here, $S, which is the reference to this blue object. In the constructor then, it will use that reference here and call the attach observer, and it passes a parameter, this, which is this object here, this blue object on the left hand side. So it will come back into our right hand side here, and it will run this attach observer method, instance method here, and it will pass the observer. So this $OBS refers to this object over here. And when this instance method it calls this updater, which remember is this bit of blue, this object down here, this glue, and it will call attach observer, and it will pass the observer reference, and that will come in here, attach observer. And what it does then, it creates its own little table here, which says that this is one of the instances that is observing this over on the right hand side. Remember, this JObserver updater instance refers solely to this object over here. It's not handling events from anything else, it's just handling events from here, but it keeps a track of the observers which want to get notifications which are associated with this publishing instance over here. So that is just what it does. It creates an entry in that table, and there could be several classes and instances over here which call attach observer, and you could have a number of entries in here. So that green step really sets up all the links in place, all the glue is in place now to handle the events. So the third aspect, or the third stage, is whenever in our right hand side we do something or other and we want to trigger an event. So we will call again this updater, which refers to this here, and we will call the update method here within this object, and we will pass the event that we want to raise plus any params, and that will run this method down here, and it will take the event and the params, and it will go through its table here and find all of the observers, and for each observer it will call the event method on that instance and pass the parameters. So it will call over here, in this instance on before x, it will call the on before x method over here and pass the parameters. So in that way the events from over here actually get result in these functions over here being called in our observer instances. And this is used by COM Content History, but I think it's also used by the Joomla plugin capability as well. So Joomla plugins use this sort of framework to actually get from the events in through to the plugins. So let's look and see how does that refer to our Hello World table and what we're doing in this versioning step. So in this case, what we want to do is we want JTable observer content history, which is this code down here. We want that to be observing what happens in our Hello World table over here. So our Hello World table, Hello World, is going to be the class which has objects which are emitting triggers, and we want those to be picked up by the content history functionality. So the first thing we do in our purple step here is we call this function add observer class to class within JObserver mapper, and we pass our observer, which is our content history, and we pass the class that we want to observe. So if we go back to our code, we can see here, we call that function and pass the two classes, the observer class and the observed class. And that really just sets that up in that table. The next thing happens, the other thing was that well, we can actually call this a JObserver mapper from anywhere, but where is appropriate to do it is actually within the constructor of our Hello World table. So if we go to our code here, here's our Hello World table, and we call JObserver mapper. And that's the first thing that we do, and that adds our observing class into this table together with the table, the class that is being observed. The next thing that we do in our code is we call the parent constructor, which is the JTable constructor. And if you look in the JTable code, you'll see inside the constructor, I think I might have it here actually, table there. This is JTable. We look in our constructor and we see here JObserver mapper, attach all observers, and just above it new JObserver updater, and passing this. So in our constructor of JTable, it will call first of all set up a new JObserver updater, which is this thing here. And then it will call JObserver mapper, attach all observers, and that will go through here in the same way as we've covered before and come down, and it will result in this little table being updated saying that the observer, in this case the content history, wants to observe events that are generated by our Hello World table class. So that is all the glue in place, and the orange arrows then refer to whenever we actually publish an event, and whenever we do that we call the update method within our blue object here, and we pass on after store. Now there's two events that are published. One is on after store whenever we update or create a record in our table, or if we delete a record, then we will pass on before delete as the event. But in both cases it works the same way. We call the update, which will then run this update here. The event is on after store and any params here, and that will then call for each observer, and one of the observers will be our content history. It will call that on after store method, so it will run that. Now you may, like me, have been a wee bit surprised that this method here, or this object here, is directly connected to this object here on the right hand side. initially you might just have thought, well, the left-hand side should be connected to the glue and the right-hand side should be connected to the glue in the middle, but not, you know, connected between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. But one thing that this direct connection enables is that this here, this instance here, now knows directly what this one is. It has a reference to our JTable. And so in our constructor, we can set up JTable is equal to this object over here. And the advantage of that is that down here, we have got a reference to the object which has got the data in. So in our code in here, we have got a reference to this JTable object here, and so therefore we can actually call the methods which are within JTable, and we can get the data in that JTable instance there, so we don't have to go to the Hello World record to pick the data. We've actually got direct connection here between this and this via this connection over here. So I'm not sure whether that was a factor and that was why the Joomla developers used that sort of construction or not, but it does provide advantages, because now in our code here on AfterStore is the functionality that sits in here, which looks at, gets the data over here, produces the hash, compares the hash, and if it's a new hash, will then actually write the data JSON encoded name value pairs into our content history. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. It admittedly is quite complex. If you want to look at the code for the general stuff here, you can find in Joomla, libraries Joomla observer, and if you look in there, if you look in this interface.php, you will see in the comments a list of the things that has to be done within the observer to set up a class to be an observer. So for example, it needs to have a create observer static method there. And if you look in the observable interface.php, you will similarly see some comments surrounding what needs to be done to make a class an observable class. So for example, it needs to have these attach observer instance methods. The only other thing I want to say was that if you look at the content table, so here's content extends table. Content doesn't call this function JObserverMapper, add observer class to class, but instead does it a slightly different way. So it calls the parent first, and then after it, it calls content history observer create observer. And that refers to, in the content, the equivalent class content, it calls this parent first, and then it calls this here, create observer. So if you like, you can kind of trace through the code there just to make sure that that second way is understandable. You can understand how it hangs together, and in fact you may like to just change the hello world code to do that. Put this parent call first and then call that other function directly, and make sure that that works. It works because we are in this class here in content. We are actually in the class that's being observed. So when we call this, we are able to pass the reference to this object. Whereas If we weren't in that class, we would have to use this functionality here because we don't have a reference to this object. So as I say, you can have a look through that, try that change, just to convince yourself you understand the different way that content uses to set that up. Having said that, I hope that all of the code then here you can kind of understand why it hangs together and why it's written the way it is. And that's about it for this video. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.